Today's episode is brought to you by Malwarebytes Privacy VPN. Preserve your privacy, encrypt your traffic, and browse boldly away from prying eyes with Malwarebytes Privacy VPN. Go to malwarebytes.com/VPN to learn more. That's malwarebytes.com/VPN.
This is probably the worst thing, in my view, that has ever happened to our rights online.
This is Lock and Code, a Malwarebytes podcast. I'm your host, David Ruiz. Our main story today is about porn. I didn't expect that one, did you? And while it sounds salacious, our main story today is about porn and who is allowed to and who is age restricted from watching it online. In June, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a Texas law that some groups worry could be a harbinger for a splintered internet. The law is titled simply HB 1181 and passed in 2023. It places new requirements on websites that portray or depict sexual material harmful to minors. With the law, if you are the owner or operator of a website that has images or videos or illustrations or descriptions that, quote, more than 1/3 of which is sexual material harmful to minors, end quote, you must verify the age of your website's visitors, at least in Texas. And with the law, if you are visiting a pornographic website while in Texas, or a website where more than 1/3 of the material is harmful to kids, you must go through online age verification, which means handing over some information of yours to watch that porn. Age verification is all around us. An age restriction on alcohol forces us to flash our ID when going to a bar. A similar restriction on tobacco results in the same exchange when picking up cigarettes at gas stations across the world. But many digital rights advocates believe that online age verification is different. And that's because online age verification, as implemented in many places today, threatens privacy, security, and anonymity online. As Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF, wrote in June, quote, a person who submits identifying information online can never be sure if websites will keep that information or how that information might be used or disclosed. This leaves users highly vulnerable to data breaches and other security harms, end quote. EFF is not alone here. In fact, a judge in Texas made similar arguments when he initially blocked HB 1181 last year, saying that the law, quote, runs the risk that the state can monitor when an adult views sexually explicit materials and what kind of websites they visit. In effect, the law risks forcing individuals to divulge specific details of their sexuality to the state government to gain access to certain speech, end quote. But those arguments did not win out. In the Supreme Court's 6-3 decision earlier this year, the justices weighed in favor of the threat to children and ruled that, quote, no person, adult or child, has a First Amendment right to access speech that is obscene to minors without first submitting proof of age, end quote. Today, to help us understand the data security and online privacy risks of the Supreme Court's decision, why age verification online is not the same as showing your ID to a cashier, and what else could be restricted under the Texas law, we're speaking with Jason Kelly, activism director at EFF and co-host of the organization's podcast, How to Fix the Internet. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
We are happy to have you on here. We have a ton to talk about, so I think it's best to just jump right in. And I want to start with a basic but likely complex question, which is what makes porn different? Because instinctively, I think a lot of people hear age restrictions on porn, and they welcome the idea. You know, like I said at the intro, we age restrict alcohol, we age restrict tobacco. So again, what makes porn different?
Let's imagine that you walk into your corner porn store We all have one that we go to. And they say, okay, you want to purchase this magazine, you hold up your ID. They don't track that information. Some bars now have like scanners, and that has its own problems. But generally speaking, this is a very different experience than you having to verify your age online to access the same kind of material. And age verification online has, we'll get into this, but a couple of different problems, a couple of different varieties that can be used to prove that you are, above a certain age. We haven't worked out a lot of the kinks in those features and those technologies, and some of those I think are unworkable, actually. Basically, once you are asked to give certain types of information to a website, and we all know this from the, hundreds of data breach emails we get or whatever each year that we have been pwned, there's no way to know what that company who's supposedly verifying your age is doing with that information. Now, you can think about this in good faith if you want, and you can say, look, what's there to worry about? I mean, ultimately, there are a couple of very reputable companies. They're contacting the government, or they have some list. I actually don't fully understand how they verify what you show them is accurate. But ultimately, information online that's shared is always vulnerable. And the Supreme Court didn't really tackle that issue at all. They didn't tackle the issue of anonymity. They didn't tackle the issue of the burden that this actually places on people, and the fact that many adults will actually not use a site that requires age verification, because ultimately most age verification is identity verification, and porn is a pretty touchy subject. And there are other ways to verify your age that don't necessarily involve government ID, but the Texas law pretty much assumes that that's what's going to happen. You can use other documentation, if you want to give them, I think it's things like your mortgage records or something like that, that show like that you own a house or something, so you're an adult. You could do that too, but all of this is very easily tied, because of how the internet works, to what you are then doing on that site. And there's no real way, I think, for an average person who logs in or logs on to, pick your random porn site, to know what happens with the information they give, to know that that site isn't a scam, to know that there's not a middleman in between the verifier and the site. There's all these problems, and that's just the beginning. I mean, in reality, these laws don't stop young people from viewing porn, because it is actually the worldwide internet. And that means that you can go to Russia, you can go to, not literally, you can go to a site in Russia, you can go to a site in, other countries, no age verification required. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on how you look at it, in the US, a lot of the sort of most popular adult content websites are now sort of consolidated. And with that consolidation has come a lot of improvements in practices. Things like, verifying consent and age for performers, things like that. That is not the case in a lot of other places. So this doesn't remove someone in Texas's ability to actually look at pornography. It's very easy to find. It just means that if they go to Pornhub, it will have a message that says you'll have to verify your age. And if I was, a 12-year-old who got that message, I would have plenty of options to go find porn in other ways. So ultimately, this is a problem for adults. It is not a solution for minors, and it is a gateway to a much bigger problem that I think is about to start.
There's a lot in there that, of course, we're going to explore. I thought it was funny you brought up this idea that one of the age verification models is like looking at mortgage records. I feel like already I can think of no more mortifying an exchange of information than revealing my identity to look at porn. But then revealing my mortgage to look at porn somehow like ranks higher. And I also think like what a bizarre like rubric to place, because I don't know if you've seen the price of homes recently, but I feel like that's an age check, not on like an 18-year-old, but like on a 43-year-old. Like this is not the same world, right?
Right.
You've hammered a couple times on how this law is not going to prevent children from seeing porn, right? For various reasons. There are websites that don't exist in the United States. There are websites that will not comply. There are websites that have never heard of this law in their lives, right? And so their operators just do not care. And so those websites could become popular. So if this law is not going to prevent children from seeing porn, I'm interested then, what is most likely to happen? You know, things that we haven't talked about already.
The real issue here is that the internet is about to bifurcate. This is not just happening in the US. That's actually part of the problem. I think that the U.S. has been, in some ways, behind a lot of other countries like Europe, which are leading some of the sort of efforts to do all sorts of regulations. And in some cases, those are helpful. In some cases, I think those are actually pretty problematic. And different countries have said either, yes, we will restrict porn with age verification requirements, or no, that is, not possible. But they're thinking about this in a different way because a lot of those countries are also in the middle of rolling out digital IDs. And here in the US, there aren't very many digital ID systems for states. There's not a single method. And like you said, instead of being able to, flash my California ID token that says I'm 40 whatever and don't own a home. I have to do another thing, right? So the country is about to experience this like sort of widespread engagement with these age verification systems. And those systems are going to start being tested, and some of them are going to cause real privacy problems. Some of them are going to start to be seen on sites that I would say, and many others would say, I think, are not actually porn sites. And that really is the biggest concern here, I think. I've been coining this term. You're the first to hear it. There's sort of the clear net and the dark web, right?
Yeah.
I think we're about to create what I'm calling the gray web, which is anything that is behind an age verification or identity verification requirement. I like the term gray because what gets put there is sort of in a gray area. And if you look at some of the things that certain politicians have said, they would like all kinds of LGBTQ or reproductive rights content to be included behind those age verification and identity verification restrictions. And as a result, I think that, our next step is sort of making sure that the courts and everyone else who I think as a normal human, for the most part, understands the difference between an anatomy chart and a hardcore porn video, that we push to make sure that the definition of sort of those, harmful materials stays as strictly as possible applied to actual pornography, right? But states have already introduced sorts of laws that want to remove all kinds of material from schools, from libraries, and trying to figure out how to redefine this kind of material to include other kinds of material is, I think, the next step. And so, what's going to happen is, first of all, we're all going to download VPNs. And that's just one more reason why this law doesn't work. But also, people are probably going to experience a lot more of these kinds of age verification pop-ups. And they're either going to give in, and share some form of information. They're going to bounce, which happens quite a bit according to studies. And ultimately, how annoyed that makes people, I think, depends on that's sort of how we will see what happens next. And my hope and EFF's goal is to work together with as many different people and coalitions as possible to make sure that, this bifurcation doesn't expand, because you can sort of look around and see what kind of material is already being hidden, being restricted, being removed, and platforms already have content moderation problems. If they get a whiff that a state attorney general or what have you thinks that their law, whatever it is, should also cover this other kind of content, they may start restricting it as well. And, you don't even necessarily have to pass the law for that to happen. But the thing that I think we have to really make sure of is that the gray web stays as small as possible and is a place where, adult content lives that is actual adult content.
So there's a couple things here that you mentioned. One, this term, the gray web, using Lock and Code to hard launch this term. I mean, you have your own podcast, man.
I'm working on an op-ed right now, but it's you make a good point. You make a very good point.
But more seriously and to the point, you are, I think, very diplomatically describing what is a censorship regime in the making. And I think it's important to call it what it is, right? Using these age verification laws as a sort of smokescreen to potentially actually remove other types of content, non-adult content, non-pornographic content from the web, or at least remove people's access, easy access, anonymized access to that content. And so I think the question here is, when we are forecasting, again, this censorship regime, and I do see it as well, because in the UK, Spotify allegedly is now asking people to scan an image of their face to access Spotify, which I don't know how you make a pornographic playlist. Maybe I am unskilled. Maybe there's some things going on. But the big question here is, why is that happening? And give me more examples of it, because that's a big claim. So why is it happening? And yeah, help us just dive into more of what you're seeing.
Sure. So the Online Safety Act in the UK, right, that basically went into effect, and the Spotify example you just gave is a really good one. Another example that's come up is different types of subreddits have started to require people to do age verification to access them, like the Stop Smoking subreddit.
What?
Right? The Al Jazeera subreddit. Different kinds of forums beyond, Reddit. Yes, some of the things being blocked are potentially, I think there is an actual gray area whether the anime art and hentai gallery should be included in this law. I mean, I get it, right? But one of the things that's happening is just, well, there are two problems here. One, there is an active push to, redefine what material is harmful to young people. And you can see this, based on all sorts of actual actions that have been taken in the US. I would say the same is true in other countries. I'm not as familiar with the sort of political analysis in those places. So you have this other issue, which is that if you tell a website that they need to age verify before showing people certain material, but that definition is vague, which is, probably going to be the case, they will over-censor, right? So this is something we've worried about for a long time because it's already happened, and we have all kinds of proof for, sites like Facebook and things like that. And this is one of the problems with, some of the age verification laws that we have been so far, able to stop at the federal level, like the Kids Online Safety Act, because everyone has a different idea of what material is harmful to young people. And a lot of people think social media is harmful to young people. Yeah. A lot of people think certain topics within social media are harmful to young people. So there's a sort of understandable concern for certain topics and young people seeing them, overlapping with a vagueness in laws, overlapping with a much more censorship-oriented intention overlapping with this sort of porn idea that now it's allowed in the US to go behind age verification. All those things combined, evidence very quickly, if you want to look, you can start out just for now by going to a website called blocked.org.uk, which talks a little bit about some of the examples. And this is just for the Online Safety Act. But just right now, before there are any laws restricting the access to information about reproductive rights content, for example, there are no laws that say, you're not allowed to talk about mifepristone online, right? Even though in some states you cannot actually buy it in the state. Yeah. We're working on a project right now that involves documenting takedowns on various platforms of people literally just talking about how abortion pills work. So there are mistakes that tend to err on the side of losing access to information. There are actual people with real interests in censoring content because, ultimately, I think they want to reshape society and they're upset with their inability to do so. And one way to do that is to say, I can't outlaw being LGBTQ yet, but I can find ways to stop young people from seeing that material. And then you have this sort of now agreed upon constitutionality of age verification requirements on adult material. All of this together is a sort of giant turning point for the internet. And I think, not to tell everyone to freak out or anything, but over the years, there have been a lot of big issues that have come up in the digital rights world and just in general, and net neutrality, things like that. This is probably the worst thing, in my view, that has ever happened to our rights online, because the U.S. actually has had an enormous impact on the growth of the internet and on the availability of access to information. Yes, good and bad, but just in general, because of our strong First Amendment protections, which had been up until now recodified by the Supreme Court. And this Supreme Court has finally been the one to say, well, the internet's big enough, and we think that there should be two kinds of internets. And it's very scary, but I don't think we've lost the fight yet, right? I think we still have a lot of work to do. We did lose the age verification for adult content battle, but some of the things that I think we still need to work on and can work on is making sure that digital ID, as it gets rolled out, which I think it will, is as safe and secure as possible. There are some features that can be added or removed from different digital IDs that you could then use to verify your age that will be more secure than, showing your mortgage application before you go to the boob site. So, not saying that digital ID is the solution to everything, but, there are different ways we can at least do some harm reduction, and we can minimize the expansion of this. But that battle is really just beginning.
Theboobsite.com is the name of my local porn store. It's a retro 90s chic,
They only sell VHSs.
Yeah, exactly. When I hear something like, this is the worst threat, this is one of the worst things that's happened to our online rights, it's alarming. It does, I think, call some folks into action, but I also want to better contextualize what's at stake here. We've talked around a lot of this. Sure. We've talked about this very confusing, sometimes reversed into Supreme Court decision. We've talked about the legitimacy. We've talked about some of the history. But what are the actual online privacy risks of handing over my identity to a porn website, right? As we know them right now, there are things like you said, there's things like, here's my mortgage. There's, like we said with Spotify, scan my face. There's no digital ID equivalent, federally right now. I know Louisiana has its own stateside kind of program, like an app, a digital ID app, but looking at these kinds of methods of, okay, your credit card behavior, your mortgage, your face, like your facial recognition information, or just your ID, your driver's license. What is the online privacy risk of these verification models online?
I have to say, I love nothing more than going through the list of different age verification options and just shooting each of them down one by one. These kinds of age verification companies, right? There are many, many, many people trying to fill this space. There are companies, underbidding other companies, right? Because the way this often works is sort of like, we have, 5 methods. We'll charge 0.2 cents for each verification. And then someone comes along and is like, I'll charge 0.1 cent, right? So they're all sort of fighting each other, and they're all offering all of these different options. So what they're not necessarily doing, and what many laws don't really do, nor do they have a sort of great method of confirming this, is require that any information you share is deleted. They don't have a method of protecting it from being shared. Some of them, of course, say that that's not allowed, right? That restriction on not sharing data or not collecting it, I don't think that anyone listening to this thinks that that's working very well. The internet is pretty filled with leaked information and collected information that you didn't know was collected. So let's say you go to the boob site and they say you just have to do 2 things to enter: hold your ID up, your driver's license if you have one, and then take a picture of your face, and we'll compare them. And then I'm not exactly sure, but the magic happens, and they say, okay, you're allowed on the site. Yeah. That ID should immediately be deleted, but is it? I don't know. The sort of methods that you talked about that are involving biometrics, which sort of so one of the problems here is that, that first method I mentioned, if you don't look like your driver's license for some reason, you might not be able to use that method. If you don't have a driver's license, which millions of people actually don't have a state ID or a government ID in the US and other places, you can't use that method. That's where hopefully, now, of course, if you have a mortgage, you're fine. But my guess is that people without state IDs probably also don't have a mortgage. Another method that YouTube has just implemented is based on your browsing history, making a sort of guess about whether or not they need to age verify you. So again, all of these things aren't going to work very well. They all have sorts of flaws. And at any point, information can be collected, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of little checkboxes next to the word encrypted. There's going to be a lot of pop-ups that say we delete the information as soon as we collect it. But as a user, there is really no way to verify this. I mean, it's quite hard, right? I mean, you can't even really figure out what information Facebook has about you. You can press a export button and they'll send you a confusing JSON file. But right now, data brokers, if you want to know what a data broker has on you, in pretty much every state, California will change a little bit in January, you have to ask each of them individually, and to do that, you have to prove your identity, which means that you also have to verify your identity with them, which involves, again, identity verification, just for them to tell you what information they have on you. So the risks here are both to the privacy of your information, and it can, how it can be connected to the sort of sites that you visit. My mom had to recently register for the Social Security office, I guess, online. Yeah. And I was on the phone with her trying to help her walk through it because it requires something similar. It's either you do an online verification or you, I think, go to a local office. And I can tell you one thing, my mom is never going to see porn again. Once Ohio passes that law, it took me an hour to help walk her through the identity verification process for the Social Security office. When you get to a site and it says just download this software to verify your ID, or just click this link, that we're going to send you to verify your identity, or you go to a website that doesn't ask for identity verification because it's, located in another country, which a lot of people, that's where they're going to end up. You're going to get all kinds of problems. You're going to get malware, you're going to get tracked, you're going to get blackmailed. I mean, not you specifically, listener, but people are going to run into these problems. There are going to be scams left and right and privacy violations left and right. So the security and privacy issues here basically mean that in a worst case scenario, you get malware that record, there were these spam texts or something or emails that went out for a while that were like, we've got video of you watching porn.
Yeah. Sextortion threats, false
Sextortion.
threats.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. False sextortion scams. Yes. Welcome to the world of real ones, because imagine, okay, first to enter the site, you got to use your webcam or whatever. You got to use your camera to verify your identity. Then maybe you have to download this tool or click this link and we'll verify your identity for you. And we'll delete it for sure. Or we'll say that, and then we will track every single video you watch. We will have your name and address. We will have video of you potentially, because again, they did get to turn on your camera or use your camera, and not everyone is, able to know when those things happen and stop happening. It really just, none of this was discussed, as far as I understand, in the Supreme Court sort of decision. But the threats here are pretty massive, and part of that is because we introduced a requirement, we allowed a law well before we have actually the technology that can solve this problem, if there is such a thing. So I think that both the future of the internet is unfortunately going to be one where we have to fight to protect content from being censored behind age verification walls and identity verification restrictions, and one where people who don't know much about the internet, and that's a lot of people, are going to be running into all kinds of security, privacy, phishing, and other malware kinds of scams.
What you were mentioning there about real sextortion threats, I think it rings pretty strongly for those of us here at Malwarebytes, because we do see, like I was saying, hollow sextortion threats. And for folks who don't know what that is, right, it's that you will get an email or a text that says someone has hacked your webcam and they have video of you while you are looking at porn. The thing is that these are never real. These are fake. They're just threats, right? They make their threat feel authentic by pairing it with another piece of data. Sometimes we've seen, right, like a data breach will have your password, released through it. And so they'll say, hey, I have your password. Therefore, it proves that I was able to hack into your webcam. Again, this happens a lot because people repeat passwords. So if one password is exposed, they're like, well, that's my one password. So clearly they were able to get into my webcam and to look at me while I was looking at things that I would hope people don't know that I look at. And so that's the scam. Sometimes we also see it paired with this kind of interesting Google Maps screenshots. So, you can find someone's address online. Like, it's not very difficult. It's very easy. And so someone will say, again, as a way to just bump up that threat, bump up that fear factor, there's just a screenshot of your address, on Google Maps. And it says, I know where you live, And so these are things that are very, very frightening. I think folks who are falling for these types of scams, there's no blame here, right? The blame is always on the scammer. These are very, I think, frightening situations. And so to know that there's pieces of data out there that we could be handing over in order to literally access porn, like, oh, that's a real piece of information. That's not fake. That's a real, like, yes, you did scan your face. You did take a photo and then also paired it with your driver's license, and that let you access our favorite site right now. That's concerning. That's worrying. People, I think, would rightfully be afraid of that information leaking. I do have one last question. There is I think, warranted and legitimate concern from parents who don't want their kids looking at a lot of porn online. Like, porn can be very violent. It can be very, it's not even about the violence. It's just about I don't want my kid looking at porn. That's a totally normal thing for a parent to feel. And so when they hear something like this, they hear like two dudes who don't have kids being like, this is wrong for this reason, X, A through Z, and then, A1 through Z1. But none of them touch on, okay, well, what am I supposed to do about that, right? Like, can we get down on the ground again? And so I do ask for parents who are legitimately worried about this stuff, about their kids accessing porn at an early age, about finding something on the iPad that they wouldn't have been able to find, many, many years ago. What advice do you have for those parents?
In all seriousness, I recognize the complications. A study came out a couple of weeks ago that showed that filtering software, which does exist, and I'm not going to say it's all perfect or it's easy to use, is basically like unheard of and underutilized. This kind of thing can exist at the device level, at the, network level. There are phones designed for children or for young people. Mm-hmm. That's not going to solve every problem because some people don't give their kids a phone until they're 16. Some people give their kids a phone when they're 8. You could give a kid a phone when he's 16, but he might have gone over to a friend's house and that friend has the internet. And if you're a 14-year-old, if you're anything like me, then you're probably going to end up on a porn site at some point, right? Yeah. We often deal with these sort of systemic issues by making laws that don't really tackle the problem, focus sort of the wrong way. And what I would love is for more people to understand how different filtering tools work and also to think really carefully about what devices people have. I know that you have a Chromebook when you're probably 8 right now because like your school gives it to you, right? But again, you can't use that usually to go to a porn site unless you're like an 8-year-old hacker, in which case like I'm kind of okay with it. There are ways to get around this that do not require a state or nationwide law that forces every adult to give up their privacy. They are not perfect, and I think everyone knows that, but I also think I would say very few people have invested the time to look into those. And also, a lot of people who have a really big concern about this kind of issue are also concerned with other types of content, right? I mean, porn is not the only problem that a young person might run into online, and I am also happy to admit it. But I think that this growth of the internet, this availability of information and pornography has happened very quickly, and it didn't exist when I was 8, basically, or almost not at all. And now if I was, a more successful person in my dating life, I might have an 8-year-old right now, right? So it's happened very quickly, and I think it's very important to say, yes, that's true. We all recognize that, and like, wow, this is something that we have to reckon with, There are, organizations like all over the internet that work on this issue. Whether you're trying to find apps that are safe for kids, phones that are safe for kids, tablets, TV shows, right? All of these things do exist. It's just a lot of work, and it's way more work than, my parents had to do because there was just a much smaller internet at the time, right? But I do think like a lot of things veer really quickly into what I would call moral panics. And I think that there is a legitimate concern here, but it also, in a sort of way that every Save the Children concern has this unfortunate outcome, often ends up pulling in people who are pretty obsessed with other moral panics, right? And then suddenly you have a law that doesn't just restrict pornography, it restricts information about LGBTQ things, it restricts information about how abortions work, it restricts all kinds of things. I think most people, I'm not saying again that you should talk to your 8-year-old about abortions, but this law doesn't solve really anything. And I think if you are a really dedicated parent, you can find ways to work on it. I'm not a dedicated parent, but that's because I'm not a parent at all.
Jason, I wanted to thank you again for coming on today's show, telling us about age verification, telling us about how kids are wily and they will evade age verification, and what else parents can do to, I think rightfully look after their kids and parent them. So again, thank you for coming on today's show.
Thank you so much, David.
To our listeners, we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe. And remember, you can read all our cybersecurity coverage on Malwarebytes Labs at malwarebytes.com/blog. Finally, our intro music is by Kevin MacLeod from incompetech.com, and our outro music is by Woa from unminus.com. Today's show has been edited by our podcast consultant, Eric Johnson, at lightningpod.fm. Thank you, folks.